The observation was scheduled for a Tuesday, which I only mention because nothing good has ever started on a Tuesday. I'd been running the repair bay at Cathara 9 for 3 years by then, 3 years of 12-hour rotations, of hydraulic compound under my nails, of eating my lunch on the hood of whatever I was currently elbow-deep in. The bay was mine in every practical sense. It had been assigned to the human contingent when the way station opened, which meant it had been assigned to me because I was the human contingent's senior technician and the other two were Pell and Chew, who were good with their hands but still looked up when things got strange. Strange was most days. I had stopped looking up. Cathara 9 sat at a junction point in the Cedral corridor, which made it useful to several species and agreeable to none. The station had been built by a consortium that no longer existed, managed by an administrative body that had changed names twice in my tenure there, and populated by a rotating cast of species who treated each other with the professional wariness of strangers sharing a long-haul transit. Not hostile, not warm, just tolerant in the specific way that people who need each other and don't especially like each other manage to get along. The Drevhari used it most heavily after us. Their transit lanes ran through it. Their supply tenders refueled here, and their engineering teams rotated through on 6-week cycles, which meant I had been watching Drevhari engineers work for 3 years the same way they had been watching me. We had not arrived at mutual admiration. The Drevhari were, by any structural measure, superior engineers. That's not a concession I make lightly. I make it because it is accurate, and I have no patience for accuracy being sacrificed for pride. Their manipulator hands had 6 fingers, the last 2 of which could operate independently at angles a human wrist doesn't permit. Their instruments were extraordinary. Precision down to tolerances I couldn't read on our gauges, calibration suites that self-corrected in real time, diagnostic arrays that could map a drive system in 40 seconds. They worked cleanly, methodically, and according to documented procedures that had not changed in 400 years because 400 years ago their engineering caste had solved, in their estimation, most of what needed solving. What I mean when I say most of what needed solving is, the Drevhari engineering caste had built its authority on completeness. Their documentation system covered every known failure mode for every component they manufactured or maintained. Every repair had a procedure. Every procedure had been validated, tested, revised, validated again, and filed. When a Drevhari engineer encountered a fault, they opened their documentation and they found it there, because if it wasn't there by the logic of the system, it couldn't exist, or at least it couldn't exist yet. And when it did exist, they would document it and validate the procedure and file it, and then it would exist properly. The system was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 38,000 failure modes, 400 years of compiled field data. A diagnostic infrastructure that could tell you not only what had failed, but where in its service life the failure had become inevitable. I had the highest respect for the documentation. I also had 3 years of watching what happened when reality and the documentation disagreed about which failure they were dealing with. They also had, in my experience, a specific kind of blind spot. I'd noticed it in the first month. I kept noticing it. I never mentioned it because it wasn't my business, and because 3 years of cross-species professional contact had taught me that nothing useful comes from telling another species what they're missing. You wait. Eventually, the missing thing introduces itself. The observation session had been arranged by Velsoren, the current rotation's senior engineering attaché, as part of what the Drevhari called a technical exchange protocol. I'd been asked, through 3 layers of station administration, whether I would consent to allow Drevhari engineering personnel to observe a standard repair cycle in my bay. The request was phrased politely. The subtext, which I read clearly, because after 3 years you learn to read Drevhari subtext, was that the exchange protocol was partly a formality, partly a curiosity, and partly a structured opportunity for the Drevhari engineering cast to document their findings about human workshop practices, for their records, for their files, for whatever report Velsorin was drafting that would eventually get filed somewhere and tell whoever read it what the Drevhari already believed, that human methods were approximate, inefficient, and charming in the way that a child's drawing of a machine is charming, recognizable in intent, imprecise in execution. I said yes. I had a Threnali courier shuttle on the bench that needed its secondary coolant loop rebuilt, which was fiddly, honest work. Let them watch. They sent 6. Velsorin led them in personally, which I hadn't expected. He was tall for a Drevhari, with the pale green coloring that indicated seniority in the engineering caste. Their skin deepened toward that shade with age the way ours develops lines, and he moved the way senior Drevhari always moved, with an economy that suggested every motion was pre-approved. Behind him came 5 junior engineers, all carrying documentation tablets, all wearing the gray-silver field uniform of the caste, all maintaining the expression I had come to think of as politely interested in a thing that is not interesting. They arranged themselves along the perimeter of the bay in a loose arc, equidistant from each other, as if they had been briefed on how to stand. Pell and Chu were present. Pell was under the far end of the Threnali shuttle doing something to the undercarriage mounting, and Chu was at the supply bench calibrating replacement seals. Neither of them looked up when the Drevhari filed in. I appreciated that about them. I was already at the courier's coolant manifold when they arrived, which is where I intended to stay. I had the access panel off, the secondary loop exposed, and I was in the middle of mapping the failure point by feel, running my fingers along the conduit seams until I found the section that had the wrong temperature differential. Instruments can tell you a conduit is failing. Hands tell you where. I heard Velsorin say something to the engineer beside him. My Drevhari was functional rather than fluent, but I caught the operative word, the one their engineering caste uses for methods that rely on personal assessment rather than documented procedure. It doesn't translate exactly. The closest equivalent in our vocabulary is artisanal, and they don't mean it as a compliment. In Drevhari engineering culture, the personal assessment, the judgment call, the experienced hand, the educated guess, was what you used when the documentation ran out, and running out of documentation was a failure condition. You didn't celebrate your ability to improvise. You celebrated your ability to build systems thorough enough that improvisation was never required. What I was doing at the Threnali manifold was, in their framework, a symptom of an incomplete system. They were recording it as a data point in a report about human engineering limitations. I found the failure point. Third seam from the manifold junction, a hairline separation that the diagnostic had flagged as potential rather than confirmed. The diagnostic was right about where. It had missed what? It was a microfracture in the seal material rather than a seam failure, which meant the standard repair protocol, replace the seam coupling, would fix the symptom and miss the cause. 6 months later the seal would fail upstream, and they'd have the same problem in a different location. I'd seen it twice in Threnali ships. They run their coolant loops hotter than the manufacturer specs because their cargo compartments run warm and someone in their engineering division compensated for it decades ago, and the compensation became standard practice without anyone updating the underlying documentation. The failure taxonomy in the Drevhari system listed this as a seam fault. It was not a seam fault. The taxonomy was wrong, and nobody had been wrong in the right way yet to notice. I pulled the section and laid it on the bench. One of the junior Drevhari engineers moved slightly forward in the arc. Not much, a centimeter, maybe 2, enough to indicate attention. I could see from my peripheral vision that his tablet was oriented toward me. Recording. I got the replacement seal material from the bench, not the standard coupling from the kit, but a different grade, slightly thicker, rated for higher thermal cycling. I'd had Pell pull it from stores that morning. The junior engineer's tablet moved again. Velsorin spoke, formal register, which meant he intended me to hear. Your diagnostic indicated seam failure at junction 3. It did, I said. You are replacing the seal material rather than the coupling. I am. A pause, the kind of pause that is itself a statement. The documented repair protocol for this failure type specifies coupling replacement, Velsorin said. I know the protocol. Another pause. The seal material is a non-standard grade. Also correct. I could hear him consulting with one of the junior engineers in low Drevhari, not low enough. The word for undocumented appeared. So did the word for anomalous. So did the phrase that translates approximately as proceeding without adequate basis. I went on installing the seal. Here is the thing about fixing machines that I have tried with limited success to explain to people who don't fix machines. A machine has a logic that is separate from its documentation. The documentation records what the designers intended. The machine records what has actually happened to it, every stress cycle, every thermal deviation, every repair that was done and every repair that wasn't, every time someone ran it harder than the specs advised. These two records diverge the moment you take the machine out of the factory. A machine that has been in service for 10 years is not the machine its documentation describes. It is a specific object with a specific history, and the documentation is a map of a place that no longer exists in exactly that form. If you can read that second record, the machine's actual record, you can fix the machine as it is. If you can only read the documentation, you can fix the machine as it was designed to be, which is not always the machine in front of you. The Drevhari documentation system was the finest map I had ever seen. It updated continuously. It cross-referenced everything. It pulled field data from every repair log on every ship and station in the Drevhari operating sphere and synthesized it into revised procedures. It was, as a map, extraordinary. And a perfect map of a changed territory is still a map of the wrong place. I have been reading machines since I was 14 years old, starting with my grandmother's bakery equipment and working up through progressively more complicated systems until I ended up here, in a repair bay at a junction point in the Central Corridor, with 6 Drevhari engineers watching me work by feel. I installed the seal, pressure-tested the loop, ran a thermal cycle at 120% load, let it settle, ran it again. The diagnostic came back clean. I replaced the access panel. The whole job had taken 41 minutes. Standard protocol for a seam coupling replacement, which was the wrong job, ran 62 minutes. Velsorin's tablet was out now. He was nodding something. The repair is complete, he asked. Yes. The diagnostic confirms no fault. It does. And a word I didn't quite catch, that the seal material was the appropriate intervention, rather than the documented procedure. I looked at him for the first time since they'd come in. Velsorin had the expression of a man carefully maintaining neutrality in a situation he has already prejudged. I recognized it because I had used it myself, usually at customs. Yes, I said. He noted something else. I went back to work. They stayed for another hour and a half. I worked on a fuel injector assembly from a Havari long hauler, routine cleaning and calibration, nothing interesting, and then on a cracked housing from a station maintenance drone, which I braced and bonded rather than replaced because the replacement was on back order, and the drone needed to be running by end of shift. Bracing and bonding was, in Drevhari engineering practice, a temporary measure to be superseded at the earliest opportunity by a documented repair using certified components. It was not temporary in my practice. Properly done, a braced joint is frequently stronger than the original. I did not say this. They watched me do it. Velsorin's 6 engineers watched everything. They watched me check a torque setting by resistance rather than instrument, which I do because instruments lie when the threading is worn, and my hands have 30 years of knowing what correct feels like. They watch me mark a part position in grease pencil before pulling it, which I do because reassembly errors are always assembly errors made in reverse, and a mark costs nothing. They watched Pell hold a light steady for me while I worked in a confined space, which was simply efficient, and which seemed to require documentation on the tablet of the engineer nearest to him. The tablet was always out. The word intuition appeared twice more that I caught. I did not keep count. When Velsoren led them out, he paused at the bay entrance. "We appreciate your cooperation with the exchange protocol," he said. "Formal register again. Diplomatic. The observations have been recorded." "Good," I said. He left. I heard from the corridor before the door sealed one of the junior engineers say something in rapid Drevhari. The word intuition appeared. The word for unverifiable appeared. A third word I'd heard before but hadn't fully cataloged. I looked it up that evening. It meant consistent with the practices of a pre-systematic culture. It was filed under their term for charming. I finished the shift and ate my dinner and didn't think much about it, because Velsoren's report was not my problem, and because Pell had found a stress crack in the Havari hauler's main strut that I hadn't caught until he pointed it out. And that bothered me more than the Drevhari filing their findings about human intuition somewhere in their enormous network of carefully maintained certainties. The Velshareth arrived 11 days later. I knew about it before it docked because the Station Operations Center put out an all-hands traffic alert at 3:40, which woke me up, and I sat up in my bunk and read it and then read it again, because even at 3:40, there are some things you want to make sure you're reading correctly. The Velshareth was a Drevhari Accord-class heavy carrier, about 800 meters bow to stern, crewed by somewhere between 6 and 800, and serving as the sector command vessel for the Central Corridor. It was not a ship that docked at junction way stations. Junction way stations were for couriers and tenders and the occasional patrol craft. If the Velshareth was coming to Cathara 9, something was wrong with the Velshareth. I got up, made coffee, and waited. By 600, the story had filtered through the station in the way stories do, corridor to corridor, shift to shift, picked up and embellished and then corrected, and by 700 I had a reasonably clear picture. The Velshareth had suffered a failure in its primary motivator array during a routine acceleration burn. Motivator arrays on Accord-class vessels were the systems responsible for managing power distribution through the main drive. Not the drive itself, but the infrastructure that fed it, balanced it, kept it from destroying itself under load. The failure had been partial. The ship had not lost propulsion, but it had lost redundancy, which for a vessel that size, running a sector command schedule, was functionally disabling. You don't run an 800-meter command carrier on a backup. Their own engineering cast was already on it, had been on it since 2 hours into the transit, apparently. The preliminary report, which I wasn't supposed to see but which Chu's contact in Station Ops shared with her, and she shared with me over coffee, characterized the failure as a cascade deterioration in the primary phase coupling architecture, which was their way of saying that the component that managed power synchronization between the array's 4 quadrants had developed a failure mode that wasn't in the documented failure taxonomy. It had never happened before, or it had happened and hadn't been recognized as this specific failure before, or the failure taxonomy was incomplete. The Drevhari engineering documentation didn't cover it. Their field team was working from first principles, which for a cast that built everything on documented procedure was the equivalent of working in the dark. I drank my coffee and went to the bay. Pell and Chu came in at 800. We had 3 jobs on the bench: a Threnali navigation system that had been through a hard deceleration and needed its gyroscopic references re-zeroed, an environmental module from one of our own station airlocks that had developed an intermittent seal fault, and a Drevhari tender's secondary intake filter housing that had cracked in transit and been flagged as a warranty repair by Velsoren's team, before the Velshareth situation had overtaken everyone's attention. None of it was urgent enough to hurry, and all of it was specific enough to require attention, which is the best kind of morning in a repair bay. Worked. I had the nav system on the bench and the gyro platform out, running it through its calibration cycle manually. There's a step in the rezeroing process where you have to hold the reference platform stable by hand for 40 seconds while the internal clock resyncs, which the automated rig can't do reliably because the rig introduces a micro vibration at the 12-second mark that consistently errors the sync. I'd built a jig for it out of a piece of rubber-backed plate and 2 clamps. It worked fine. It worked fine every time. It was not in any manual. Across the bay, Pell was doing something to the undercarriage of the cracked filter housing that involved a great deal of careful swearing, and Chu had the environmental module on the bench and was running the seal fault through its intermittent cycle, which required patience because intermittent faults are shy. They don't perform reliably when they're being watched, only when they're not. She had been coaxing it for an hour and a half without luck. Eventually she would catch it. She always did. We were 3 hours into the shift when the bay door opened. I recognized the aide before I recognized anything else about the situation. She was junior, 22, maybe 23, the green still thin and bright in her skin the way it is before the seniority deepens it, and she had been part of Velsoren's observation group 11 days earlier. She'd been the one nearest the supply bench, with the tablet, who had moved forward slightly when I'd pulled the seal material. Third from the left. I had noticed, in the way you notice things without filing them, that she'd asked fewer questions than the others. Not because she was less engaged, because she was watching instead of asking. She stood at the bay entrance. She was not in full cast uniform. She had the gray-silver jacket but not the full formal rig, which meant she was here unofficially or at least not in a documented capacity. Her hands, I noticed, were still. Drevhari junior engineers habitually carry their tablets and habitually have them oriented to record. She had her tablet, but it was down at her side, facing inward, face against her leg. "Technician Osai," she said, "forgive the interruption." I set the gyro platform down. Pell and Chu did not look up. "No interruption," I said. She came into the bay. Not all the way, she stopped about 3 meters in, which kept her out of the working area and on the visitor side of the floor markings. Someone had briefed her on our bay protocols, or she'd read them. I appreciated that. "The Velshareth has a motivator array failure," she said. "I heard. Our engineering cast is working on it." She paused. "They have been working on it for 16 hours. "I heard that too." She looked at me. There was something in the look that I'd seen occasionally in Drevhari junior staff, but almost never in senior. A kind of controlled, careful honesty. The expression of someone who has weighed what they're about to say against the cost of saying it, and decided the cost is manageable. "Our senior engineers believe the failure is outside the current documented repair taxonomy," she said. "They are developing a new procedure. It will require fabrication of replacement components. They estimate," a pause, "they estimate 14 days. I said nothing. "The Velshareth cannot fulfill its sector command schedule operating on a backup array," she said. 14 days is, the term in our operational planning is impermissible. It is not a word our command uses easily. "No," I said, "I don't imagine it is." Another pause. She was very controlled. "I'm not here in an official capacity," she said. I am here because I was present during the observation 11 days ago, and I observed your repair of the Threnali coolant manifold, and I observed that you identified a failure mode that our diagnostic had characterized as something different, and that your repair was completed without documentation, without a certified protocol, and without a component from the recommended taxonomy." She stopped. "I am not saying that as a criticism." "I know you're not," I said. "I am saying it because I have been thinking about it since Tuesday," she said. I almost smiled. "What's your name?" I asked. "Kathavar," she said. "Engineering 6th, current rotation." Engineering sixth was the bottom of the cast's formal structure. It was also, in my experience, where the best instincts lived, before 3 decades of documented procedure smoothed them flat. Kethavar, I said, what exactly has failed in the motivator array? She told me. She knew it in detail, not because she'd been part of the repair team, she explained, but because she'd read every diagnostic report filed since the failure began. She'd been reading them since the alert came through, which meant she'd been reading them at 3:40 this morning and probably before that. The phase coupling system between quadrants 2 and 4 had developed a resonance fault. The two quadrants were, in effect, talking to each other at a frequency that was creating destructive interference in the power distribution. The result was asymmetric loading in the main drive feed, which the safety systems were detecting and choking to prevent damage, which was why the ship was running at 30% capacity and declining. The resonance frequency had been identified. What hadn't been identified was why it had developed, and critically, why the standard recalibration procedure, which should have corrected it, had been applied twice and twice failed to hold. I listened to all of it. While she talked, I picked up the gyro platform from the bench and held it the way I'd been holding it and let the resync cycle run, because 40 seconds is 40 seconds, and the Threnali needed their navigation system. They've tried the recalibration twice, I said. Yes. Same result both times. The resonance returns within 2 hours of each recalibration. And their working theory is component failure, that a physical component in the phase coupler has degraded. Correct, they are fabricating a replacement. But the diagnostic doesn't flag a component failure. She was very still. No, she said, it does not. They believe the diagnostic is insufficient for this failure mode. I put the gyro platform back down and checked the sync status. Clean. I clamped it off and moved the calibration rig to the next position. Kethavar, I said, 14 days to fabricate and install. Yes. If I looked at it. She waited. If I looked at it and I thought I could do something useful, it would be unofficial. I would not be filing a procedure. I would not be working from your documentation. I understand, she said. Your engineering command would probably object. Yes. Has anyone told them you're here? No, she said. I ran the second calibration position. The gyro settled. I moved to the third. Tell me where the array access is, I said. The Velshareth's engineering spaces were large in the way that engineering spaces on a vessel that size are always large. Not designed for comfort, designed for machinery, with the high overhead and the dense vertical infrastructure, and the sound that lives in the walls of big power systems under load. They had an escort for me, not Kethavar, who had returned to her assigned duties before anyone noticed she'd been gone, but a senior engineer named Velrathan, who had clearly been told to take me to the array, and who was doing so with the expression of a man who had been told to do something he found distasteful and had accepted because the alternative was worse. He said nothing to me from the bay entry to the array access. I said nothing to him. We understood each other. The motivator array occupied a chamber on the Velshareth's second engineering deck, a ring of equipment housings surrounding a central column that ran from deck to overhead, carrying the main power conduit. The phase coupling system was in the base of that column. The access panels were already off. Velrathan's colleagues had been working here, and the signs were everywhere. Tools racked precisely, diagnostic terminals arrayed around the base of the column, a fabrication crate near the far wall with component specifications laid out on its surface. Systematic, thorough, working from every piece of documentation they had. 3 engineers were present when we arrived. They looked at me. They looked at Velrathan. One of them, the most senior by his coloring, said something I caught only partially, but the word for irregular was in it, and so was the word for sanctioned, with the inflection that made it a question. Velrathan said something back, shorter than what he'd been asked, which in my experience means the shorter answer is the true one, and the longer answer would have been complicated. They stood back. I set my kit down. I'd brought the kit I always brought for primary systems work. The manual gauges, the test leads, the contact probes, the small hammer, the roll of gray cloth that I'd carried since the bakery and that had been washed so many times it was more gray suggestion than gray fact. No tablet. No automated diagnostic suite beyond the portable thermal scanner I kept in the side pocket. The three engineers watched me unroll the kit on the deck. Their expressions were Velsarin from 11 days ago, politely interested in a thing that is not interesting. I started at the phase coupler housing, not opening it, just listening. The system was running at limited load, which meant there was power in it, which meant there was sound. Different power systems make different sounds. Healthy power systems make sounds that are consistent, a bass frequency, harmonics that follow predictably from it, the sound of a machine doing what it was designed to do. Unhealthy power systems make sounds that argue with themselves. People who haven't done this work tend to picture it as something mystical, a kind of mechanical intuition, an ear trained by years of exposure to a frequency that only the experience can hear. It isn't mystical. It's pattern recognition at low resolution. After long enough around running machinery, you develop a reference library. This is what a healthy bearing sounds like at this load. This is what a worn bearing sounds like. This is the difference between vibration that's driven by the system and vibration that's driving it. You build that library without noticing, the way you learn a language by living in it rather than studying it. Then one day you're standing next to something you've never heard before and it's wrong, and you know it's wrong, and the knowing is faster than any conscious process of diagnosis. You can be wrong. I have been wrong. But the pattern recognition fires whether you have documentation or not, and sometimes it fires on things the documentation cannot see. I moved around the base of the column slowly, one hand on the housing, not the casing itself, which carries conducted vibration and lies, but the mounting brackets, which carry structural vibration and tell the truth. 4 brackets. The sound at each one was different in the way that mattered. Behind me, I could hear one of the 3 engineers speaking quietly to another. The word diagnostic appeared, so did the word for instrument. I ignored both. The 4th bracket was the one. Not the loudest, the 2nd bracket was louder, and that was probably why the diagnostic was pointed at quadrant 2's coupling interface. But loud is not the same as wrong. The 4th bracket had a vibration that was intermittent in a way the 2nd bracket's wasn't. It was pulsing slightly, with a periodicity that didn't match the system's operating frequency, which meant it wasn't being driven by the power system, which meant it was driving the power system. I straightened up and looked at Velrathan. "How old is the mounting for quadrant 4's coupling interface?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me the way people look when they've been asked a question that doesn't map to any question they were expecting. The physical mounting, the structural bracket, how long has it been in service? He consulted with the senior engineer who consulted a terminal. A period of time was mentioned. I converted to years in my head, somewhere between 31 and 35, which in Drevhari engineering standards for primary array components was well within service life. Well within. Not a thing anyone had been looking at. "Has the mounting been stress-tested recently?" I asked. Another consultation. The answer came back translated through Velrathan. No, because the mounting was within service life and showed no anomalous readings on structural diagnostics. "Structural diagnostics measure gross deformation," I said, "not resonance transmission." Silence. I got down on the deck and put my ear against the mounting bracket. Later, much later, after it was over, Kethavar told me that the senior engineer's comment at this moment had been that observing a human place their auditory organ against a primary drive mounting was simultaneously the most alarming and the most anthropologically significant thing he had witnessed in 30 years of field engineering. She told me this with the very slight, precise smile that I came to recognize as the Drevhari equivalent of laughing out loud. But that was later. What I heard at the bracket was what I'd suspected from the vibration pattern, a stress fracture, partial in the inner mounting sleeve. Not enough to register on a structural scan, enough to allow micro-movement in the coupling interface under load movement that was, in a high-power system with tight synchronization requirements, producing exactly the resonance signature they'd been chasing. The coupling wasn't failing. The coupling was being moved. Every time they recalibrated it, it held until the load came back up, and the micro-movement started again, and the resonance rebuilt itself from scratch. They weren't going to fix this by replacing the coupler. I got back up. My knees are not what they were, and the deck of the Velsharath was not what you'd call accommodating, and I took a moment before I spoke because I prefer to say things clearly the first time. The three engineers were still arranged in the same positions they'd taken when I walked in. Velshoth's expression had shifted from guarded to something I would have called tightly controlled attention, the expression of a man who has been doing one thing for a long time and has just encountered a variable he didn't know to account for. Not alarmed, not convinced, present in a way he hadn't been when we arrived. "The phase coupler is intact," I said. The senior engineer, I still didn't know his name, nobody had introduced us, said something to Velrathan. "He asks how you can be certain," Velrathan said. "I'm not," I said, "but the mounting bracket for the quadrant 4 interface has a fracture in the inner sleeve that's letting the interface move under load. The coupler is responding to that movement. That's your resonance. If you replace the coupler and leave the bracket, you'll have the same problem in 8 months." The senior engineer said something else. Velrathan translated, "The structural diagnostic shows no fault in the mounting." "I know. The fracture is in the inner sleeve, which the structural diagnostic reads as part of the coupler assembly rather than the bracket. It's a taxonomy error in the diagnostic system. The sleeve is mechanically part of the bracket, but it's cataloged under the coupler for diagnostic purposes. You'd have to specifically ask the diagnostic to look for this, and nobody's asked, because nobody's been looking at the bracket." I stopped. "I'm not saying your diagnostic is inadequate. I'm saying it was asked the wrong question." Another silence, longer this time. Velrathan consulted with the senior engineer. The senior engineer consulted with his two colleagues. There was a period of quiet Drevhari discussion of a type I recognized. The careful, controlled disagreement of a team that has invested 16 hours in a working theory and has just been offered evidence that it is the wrong theory. I waited. I am patient. You learn patience in repair work because machines don't speed up to accommodate your timeline, and neither, in my experience, do senior engineers. "If the mounting bracket is the source of the fault," Velrathan said at last, "what is the repair?" "Stabilize the inner sleeve," I said. "If you have a replacement bracket in stores, ideal. If not, you can bond the fracture and brace the sleeve internally. Either way, you'll need to reset the coupler calibration afterward because the coupling interface will have shifted slightly during the period the bracket was failing." "Bonding and bracing," Velrathan said. "Yes." The senior engineer said something directly to me in Drevhari without going through Velrathan. He spoke slowly and clearly, which I appreciated. He said, "That is a temporary measure." "Done properly, it's permanent," I said. "Properly means the right compound at the right compression and cure time, internal brace rated for the load cycle. I've done structural bonds on primary systems that outlasted the systems they were in." Another pause. Velrathan's face had changed. Not dramatically. Drevhari senior engineers do not change their faces dramatically, but there was something in it that hadn't been there when he'd brought me in. Not quite belief. Something adjacent to it. The stage before belief where you're still arguing with the evidence but you've stopped fully trusting your argument. The repair you're describing, Velrathan said. It is. Not in your documentation, I said. I know, I'll walk you through it. He looked at me, looked at the senior engineer, looked back at me. We proceed, he said. Velrathan found the replacement bracket in deep stores after an hour of inventory search, which was better than I'd expected and better than I'd planned for. I'd been ready to bond and brace. A genuine replacement was cleaner. While he searched, I sat near the base of the column and did nothing in particular, which drove the two remaining engineers quietly uncomfortable. Drevhari engineering culture has strong feelings about productive use of time in a repair context, and doing nothing in particular near an open access panel did not map to anything in their vocabulary for productive use of time. I found this mildly amusing. I was not doing nothing, exactly. I was listening to the system under load and confirming what the bracket had told me, because the job was not finished, and I am not in the habit of making assumptions stick beyond what the machine itself confirms. The resonance signature was exactly where it should have been if the bracket theory was correct. Periodic, load correlated, quadrant 4 leading quadrant 2, by exactly the interval you'd expect from a mechanical vibration, traveling through the coupling interface before it registered in the electrical system. I was right. I did not say I was right. I waited for the bracket. At some point, the younger of the two remaining engineers, I had not caught his name, sat down on the deck at the far wall, and did something with his tablet that looked like note-taking and may have been note-taking or may have been an excuse to sit down, which I respected either way. Velshoth remained standing. He did not appear to consider sitting. In an hour he moved 3 times, once to check a terminal, once to consult something on his own tablet, once to walk the perimeter of the column housing with his hands behind his back in the manner of a man who is thinking and would prefer not to be observed thinking. I watched him do it. He was good. The 38 years were in the way he moved through a technical space, the particular ease of someone who has been inside hundreds of these rooms and knows how to read them. He paused at the quadrant 4 mounting point, did not touch it, looked at it. I said nothing. He moved on. Velrathan came back with the bracket at the 3-hour mark. I examined it. It was the right specification, properly rated new manufacture. I told him so and he noted it. The swap took 90 minutes. The bracket mounting was not designed for field replacement. It was a deep component item, the kind of thing that gets done in dry dock with the proper rig. But it was not impossible, and Velrathan's team had the tools and the skill, and once they had accepted what they were doing, the focused precision that Drevhari engineers bring to everything they actually decide to do. I directed. They executed. The senior engineer's name, I learned at some point in this process, was Velshoth, and he had been in the cast for 38 years and had never been directed by a human, and was doing it with a tightness around his gill slits that I read as professional difficulty rather than hostility. I respected him for not making it hostility. When the bracket was in and the interface was reseated, I ran the manual validation contact probe on the mounting points, one at a time, feeling for the micro-vibration. Nothing on the new bracket. I moved to the old positions, still clean. I held each probe point for 20 seconds, which was longer than strictly necessary, because I wanted to be certain and I wanted them to see me being certain. Ready for coupler calibration, I said. Velshoth handled the calibration himself. He was very good at it, precise, methodical, the 6-finger dexterity doing work that I genuinely could not have replicated with my hands. I watched him and did not pretend otherwise. You give credit where it belongs. Calibration took 12 minutes. They brought the system back up to full load gradually, 20% at a time, running the diagnostic between each step. Clean, clean, clean at 60. I listened at the bracket at each step. Nothing irregular. At full load, the sound from the column was what it should have been. A single coherent frequency, harmonics that followed predictably, the sound of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Velshoth ran the diagnostic one more time and read the output for a long time. Then he said something to Velrathan, and Velrathan translated it for me. He says, "The resonance signature is absent." "Good," I said. Another pause longer. Velshoth spoke again. He says, "You identified this from the sound of the bracket." "Yes." He asks. Velrathan started again. He asks how. This was the question I had been asked, in one form or another, every time I'd done something that couldn't be traced to a document, which was most of the interesting work in 30 years of fixing things. I had never come up with an answer that fully satisfied people. I had found something approximately true, though. "I've been listening to machines since I was 14, I said. After long enough, you stop hearing a machine as a machine and start hearing it as a system. Everything that's wrong puts a sound into the system. If you can hear the sound and read what it means, you know where to look." I paused. "It's not different from what you do. It's just a different instrument." Velrathan translated. Velshoth listened. He looked at me for a moment, a long moment, by Drevhari standards, which tend toward economy, and then he said one thing short, in a register I hadn't heard from a Drevhari engineering officer before. Velrathan translated. He says he would like to understand how. "Any time," I said. We repacked the access panels. The Velshareth's engineering team repacked their tools. I rolled my kit back up: the manual gauges, the test leads, the contact probes, the small hammer, the gray cloth, and put it in my bag and stood up. Velshoth looked at the bag, not at me, at the bag, specifically at the rolled kit. I said nothing. We left the engineering space. Velrathan walked me back to the docking corridor in the same silence as the way in, but a different silence, not the silence of doing something distasteful because the alternative is worse, something else I didn't have an exact name for. We reached the junction and he stopped. "Technician Osai," he said. "Velrathan." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The observation report, Velsoren's report from 11 days ago. It has not been finalized." "I know," I said. "I didn't know. I had assumed." "It will not be finalized," he said. I nodded. He went back toward the engineering spaces. I went back toward the docking arm. Kethavar found me in the bay the next morning. We were alone. Pell and Chu were on a mid-morning start, and she came in the same way she'd come in the day before. Jacket not full formal, tablet facing at her side. "The Velshareth departed at 600, she said. "I heard the traffic alert," I said. I was at the bench with the Havari long hauler's main strut, which was a long, dull job that I was glad to have. "Full drive, sector command schedule resumed." She paused, 14 days early. "Good," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Velshoth filed a maintenance log entry with the station," she said. "It records a successful repair of the primary motivator array." "That's accurate," I said. "The method is listed as," she looked at her tablet which she'd turned face out, "field repair utilizing cross-species technical consultation, non-standard approach, successful outcome. It cites you by name." "I'll put that on the wall," I said. She didn't respond to that immediately. Then, "Is that a human expression for?" "It means I'll be pleased to have it on record," I said. "Ah," she looked at the tablet for another moment. Then, in a register that was different from the one she'd been using, less formal, less careful, more like the expression of someone who is still processing something and doesn't quite have the vocabulary for it yet. "Velshoth is asking the engineering directorate to fund a cross-rotation observation program. Formal, structured, human workshop methods observed in full, with translation support and follow-up sessions for the Drevhari observers." I stopped working, looked at her. "He's specifically requesting," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that I was fairly sure was the Drevhari version of Rai, that the observation goes both directions. "Both directions," I said. He used the phrase reciprocal technical exchange. The proposal is 6 rotations, paired human and Drevhari engineers in each other's bays. I thought about that. Thought about Velshov's 38 years in the cast, and the look on his face when the resonance signature had come back clean, and the way he'd looked at my kit when we were packing up. Not at me. At the kit. "Tell me something," I said. "Yes. When you were at the observation 11 days ago, Velsoren's group, were you the only one who thought there was something worth understanding rather than documenting?" She was quiet for a moment, the very slight, precise smile. "I was the one who noticed you used a different grade of seal material than the protocol specified," she said. "I looked up the thermal cycling specifications for that material that evening. They matched the load profile of Threnali coolant loops operating at compensated temperatures." She paused. "I did not understand why you knew to use them without checking the specifications. I am still not certain I understand it. But I thought if someone knows something and cannot explain how they know it, that does not mean they do not know it. It means the explanation has not been found yet." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what it means." She made a note on her tablet. I went back to the strut. We worked, me on the strut, her on whatever she was nodding, in a companionable quiet that was the first companionable quiet I'd had with a Drevhari engineer in 3 years. It lasted about 20 minutes before she said, without looking up, in a register that was quite careful and quite precise, "Engineering 6th is the lowest rank in the caste structure." "I know," I said. "It is also the rank at which engineers are most commonly posted to cross-species observation rotations." I looked up. She was looking at her tablet. "The proposal is pending directorate approval," she said, "but Velshov has considerable influence with the directorate." "I expect he does," I said. She made another note. The very slight smile again, held for slightly longer this time. I finished the strut. The observation report, Velsoren's report, from 11 days prior, never appeared. It had been drafted. I later learned from a passing comment Velrathan made during the first formal exchange session, 3 months after the Velshareth left. It had been drafted and held for finalization, and then held longer and then quietly retired to whatever archive Drevhari engineering directorates maintain for findings they have decided do not need to be in active circulation. I don't know exactly what it said. I have a reasonable inference. The word for artisanal probably appeared. The word for pre-systematic probably appeared. Intuition. Unverifiable. All the words for something that works but that you can't explain through the channels you have built to explain things. I have thought sometimes about the person who would have read that report. Some administrator in the engineering directorate, 3 sectors away, who would have opened it expecting the kind of cross-species technical assessment their directorate produced 30 or 40 times a year, with its orderly columns of observation data and its careful conclusions, and who would have found instead a human who identified a seal failure by touch, corrected a cooling loop fault that the diagnostic had misclassified, braced a cracked housing with compound instead of a replacement part, and did all of it quickly, without instruments, without documentation, without a certified procedure, and who would have written in the assessment column, charming, pre-systematic, consistent with the practices of a species that had not yet completed its engineering epistemology. I thought about that administrator sometimes when the work was slow. I wondered if they ever heard about the Velshareth. Velsoren himself rotated out 8 weeks after the Velshareth incident. His replacement, a Drevhari engineering attaché named Velmurath, came to the bay on her 2nd day and asked if I'd walk her through our maintenance log protocol. Not to record it, she said, but because she wanted to understand how we tracked work on undocumented repairs. "You mean repairs where I went off protocol?" I said. "I mean repairs where the applicable protocol did not exist before the repair was performed," she said, without missing a beat. "How do you create a record for something that has no category?" I describe what I did, why I did it, and what I observed, I said, as specifically as I can. Then I write down what happened. She thought about this, and if it doesn't work, then I write down what happened, I said. She nodded slowly and made a note. That is actually a method, she said, in a tone that suggested she'd been prepared to find it wasn't. Most things are, I said. The exchange program ran for 2 years. 6 paired rotations, 12 Drevhari engineers through my bay, 6 human technicians through theirs. Pell went to Velmurath's bay for his rotation and came back with 2 techniques for micro-weld precision that I still use. He also came back with a Drevhari calibration sequence for hydraulic pressure systems that was, I admitted privately, cleaner than anything in our own documentation. I told him so, and he was pleased in the way that Pell is always pleased when he brings something good back from somewhere, quietly, without making a production of it. I don't know exactly what the Drevhari engineers took from their time in our bay. Kethavar, who was assigned as liaison for the full 2 years, a posting that Velshoth had specifically requested and the directorate had approved, told me once that the phrase that came up most often in the debrief sessions was a Drevhari idiom that she translated after some thought, as listening to what the machine is not saying. I told her that was about right. She wrote it down. She wrote most things down, which was a habit I understood, because the things that turn out to matter are not always the things that looked like they would matter when you wrote them down, and you can't know afterward which ones they were if you didn't write them all. She told me one other thing. Near the end of the 2nd rotation, sitting in the bay on what had become a comfortable, unremarkable basis. Comfortable in the way that shared spaces become comfortable after long use, not despite the differences, but because of what the differences had taught both of them. She told me that Velshoth, in his formal proposal to the engineering directorate for the exchange program, had included a line that the directorate had flagged as unusual. The directorate had asked him to clarify it. He had declined, saying it was self-explanatory. The line had read, "Human engineers possess a form of technical knowledge for which we do not currently have an adequate taxonomy. This is a deficiency in our taxonomy, not a deficiency in their knowledge." I sat with that for a moment. Did the directorate accept the proposal? I asked. They funded 6 rotations, she said. That's an answer, I said. She made a note, the very slight smile. The morning the 2nd rotation ended and the last Drevhari engineer cleared out of the bay, I was back at the bench with something routine. A Havari fuel cell that needed its exchange membrane inspected, careful work, but not complicated. The kind of work I can do without much of my attention on it. The rest of my attention was on the bay, which was quiet in a different way than it had been 3 years earlier, before the Velsharath and before Velsoren's observation group had filed in and arranged themselves along the perimeter, and watched me find a fault by feel in a Threnali coolant manifold. Pell came in at 800. He set his coffee down, looked around the empty bay, looked at me. "Quiet," he said. "Yes," I said. He picked up his coffee. "You know they requested another 2 rotations." "I heard. 6 more engineers each." "I heard that too." Pell drank his coffee and looked at the bench, and then at the general space of the bay, which was, in fact, unremarkable in every way that a repair bay can be unremarkable. The tools on their racks, the diagnostic terminals in their housings, the gray cloth folded on the corner of the bench where it always was, the faint smell of hydraulic compound and metal that lives in good working spaces and doesn't live anywhere else. What changed their minds? Pell asked. Not rhetorically, he'd been there for the observation, he'd been there for the Velshareth aftermath, but he'd missed most of the middle parts. I thought about Velshoth at the base of the column, listening while I explained where to look and why. I thought about the bracket in my hand and the sound it had made, the specific frequency of a fracture that the structural diagnostic had filed under the wrong heading. I thought about Kethavar at the observation session, standing third from the left with her tablet face in, watching instead of asking. I thought about Velsoren's report quietly disappearing into an archive, and the administrator who would have read it and filed it under charming, and how the same administrator might have felt receiving a funding request from a 38-year engineering veteran that said, without apology, "We have a gap in what we know, and it is our gap, not theirs." Nothing changed their minds, I said. They'd already noticed something. Someone gave them a reason to do something about it. Pell considered this. Then he set his coffee down and picked up his first job of the morning, and we went to work, which is what you do at 800 in a repair bay, regardless of what else has happened or might happen next. The gray cloth was on the corner of the bench. The tools were on their racks. The machines were waiting, which is what machines do. They hold the record of everything that has happened to them, and they wait for someone to come and read it. I've been reading them for 30 years. I expect I have some more years in me yet.